And the question is, why did God have the Israelites completely destroy the Old Testament peoples? So we addressed some of the Old Testament laws last week, and so this one, again, is looking at the Old Testament and what God was doing in the Old Testament. So why did God have the Israelites completely destroy the Old Testament peoples? And first we have to get a little bit of context for this. So what we're talking about here is God gave the nation of Israel, he promised them, it's called the Promised Land, because he promised them this land. And this land wasn't just this unoccupied desert. There was actually people living in it as he promised it to them. He gave this promise to Abraham, and then they went off to Egypt for quite a while, and then came back. Then they were in the wilderness, wandering around because of their unfaithfulness for like 40 years. And then finally they were able to come in and take over this land. And when they did, God said, when you come and take this land, I want you to completely destroy the peoples that are in the midst of it. So why did that happen? I want to give you two reasons this morning, and I have some points underneath each of those reasons. But those two reasons are really connected, and I think you'll see that. But we say, basically, what we're wondering is how does this come in line with the character of God? This does not sound like the loving God of the New Testament. And sometimes people say, yeah, that's a vindictive, mean God in the Old Testament, and then we've got this God of love in the New Testament. Well, one God, one story. We talked about that last week or a couple weeks ago. We have to remember that it's one story, it's one God. He is immutable, which means he has character that does not change. And so we have to reconcile what's going on in the Old Testament and what we know about God's character. So with that, why did God have the Israelites destroy the Old Testament peoples? The first reason is because, when we get to there, that they were utterly wicked. They were utterly wicked. They were completely, absolutely, without a doubt, terribly wicked people. And I don't know we always are able to grasp that, but still not working for me. Got one? But there it is. I knew it. Okay, Deuteronomy 9. If you want to go to Deuteronomy 9, we're going to look at a few things in Deuteronomy. Jump around a little bit if you can follow. But Deuteronomy 9. Now, again, for context purposes, Deuteronomy is really like the whole book is Moses' last sort of like hurrah speech, his last thing to say to the Israelites before they were going into the Promised Land. Moses wasn't going to get to go with them, and so he just writes the book of Deuteronomy. The first 4 books are really kind of recording all that happened, but then Deuteronomy is just sort of a reflection. Okay, people, I don't get to go with you, but here's what I want you to remember when you're in the Promised Land. And so here's Moses reminding the Israelites about all these things. And in the midst of that, in one of these chapters, chapter 9, Moses says this, "Hear, O Israel, you are crossing over the Jordan today to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, great cities fortified to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know and whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak?" These were like giants, literally giants. "Know therefore," verse 3, "today that it is the Lord your God who is crossing over before you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them, and he will subdue them before you, so that you may drive them out and destroy them quickly, just as the Lord has spoken to you." Verse 4 and 5 are key. "Do not say in your heart when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land." But don't say that. "But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart that you're going to possess their land, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you, in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Even in verse 6, "Know then," just in case they didn't get it, "it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stubborn people." So God is saying again and again, you guys are utterly wicked. And it's not because the Israelites are righteous, but it's because these guys are so wicked that they need to go. They can't stand. So you can think of it this way. We see it as unfair or cruel that God would completely destroy people. Like, how could he do that? But think of it the other way. Wouldn't it be more unfair or more cruel to let wicked people continually ravage and devastate a land and the people in it? Don't we ask the same question about when we say, why doesn't God stop bad people when we see bad things happen? Well, when he does stop bad people, then we say, well, why did he do that? That doesn't seem loving. So the reality is we can't have it both ways. And I really believe this question gets to the tension that we have to reconcile with of the holiness of God versus the compassion of God. And hopefully we'll see that this morning. God is both compassionate and he is holy. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile those two attributes of God, but they're both equally true. And so we have to look at that a little bit. Now, let me say a couple things about the utterly wickedness of God, of the people, and why God would want to destroy them. A couple things. First of all, God was very patient with them for 400 years. 400 years he gave them time. So if you see that, if you want to go back to Genesis 15, in Deuteronomy 9, what we just read, at the end he said, I'm reminding you, I'm fulfilling the promise that I gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in Genesis 15, we see the promise that God told to Abraham. This is the very beginning of the promise that he said. And in there's just a couple verses there that I want to look at. God said to Abraham, Genesis 15:13, know for certain that your descendants, be the Israelites, will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. He's talking about when they go down to Israel, or down to Egypt. So they're down in Egypt 400 years, being enslaved and oppressed. And then if you skip down to verse 16, God says, then in the fourth generation, they will return here. And he was in the promised land when he said that. They will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So here, God is saying, okay, these people, they're pretty wicked, but I want to give them some time. So just go hang out in Egypt for a while, get big and strong, and we'll see what's going to happen to these guys. And God is also all-knowing, so that's the other thing we have to reconcile. But he's saying that the wickedness of Amorite is not yet complete. I can't send you in now. I want to give them more time. God gave them 400 years. 400 years. I mean, if God gives us 40 years, we could be considered gracious by all means. And yet he gave them 400 years. Now, also I want you to consider, and we're going to look next, at just how wicked they were at the beginning of that 400 years. And then think about how much worse it could get if that wickedness continues to fester for 400 years. And you get a picture of just how utterly wicked they were. If you turn just a couple chapters over to Genesis 18:32, you get another picture of this. This is the beginnings of Sodom and Gomorrah, if you're familiar with that story, and God rescued Lot out of Sodom. There was all this wicked, evil things happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. And before God goes in, he goes down to visit Abraham, and he reconfirms this promise that, yes, because they didn't have a kid yet. And he says, you're going to have this mighty nation, and they're starting to question it. God goes to reconfirm, no, it's going to happen. You and your wife Sarah, it's going to happen. And he went to tell him that, and then he goes down to visit Sodom and Gomorrah. God does through angels in Genesis 18. And so as they're going down, they say, well, Abraham's going to be like the father of this mighty nation. Shouldn't we tell him what we're going to do? So they have this conversation, and this is really like Middle Eastern. So they start this almost like bartering. God's going to go down. He says, hey, they're exceedingly wicked. And again, remember, this is the beginning of 400 years. They're exceedingly wicked. I'm going to go and destroy this city. And Abraham starts saying, Lord, that's not like you. You wouldn't do that, would you? Would you sweep away the righteous and the wicked together? That just doesn't seem right. I think it's very pertinent to our question this morning. And so they start sort of bartering. And Abraham says, would you do it for 50? And God says, no, if you find 50, there's 50 righteous there. I won't destroy them. Fine. They keep going down. If you go all the way down, Genesis 18:32. Then Abraham said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak only this once. Suppose 10 are found there. 10 righteous is what he's asking. And God said, I will not destroy it on account of the 10. Now, the thing that's important to what we're talking about this morning is that God could not find even 10 righteous people in that city. Not even 10 righteous people. Because he destroyed it. He said, if I find 10, I won't destroy it. And it got destroyed. There were not even 10 righteous people in that city. Okay, think about that. Now add 400 years of wickedness to that, and you get to the place where it was when the Israelites were coming in. And so we see that God, he was very patient. He would have relented, even if he could have found 10, but he couldn't. Just a picture of the wickedness. And the last thing I want to mention under this, the utterly wickedness of the people, is the concept of the sins of the parents having consequences on the children. Sometimes we think, well, what about the innocent children? Like, that doesn't seem right. Well, if there's a couple verses there. Exodus 20 is in the Ten Commandments. So you should know your Ten Commandments. If you don't, I encourage you to know them. That's the fifth commandment. And it's kind of one of the first longer ones. The Lord says, you shall not worship them, any false gods, or serve them, for I am the Lord your God, and a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And then Deuteronomy 7:9 goes on to say that those thousands are thousands of generations. So the goodness of the Lord lasts for thousands of generations. And when people don't respect the Lord, he says it lasts. It has a residual effect for sometimes 3 or 4 generations. And we just have to realize that's a reality. Let me give you a couple examples. First from the Bible. We talked about Abraham. Abraham once lied to save his skin. When he went to a foreign nation, he said his wife was his sister because he thought it would protect him better, which is only a half lie because they were like half sister. It's a weird situation. And so he did that. Well, guess what? Now he has a son, Isaac, and his son Isaac finds himself in the same situation, and he lies also to save his skin in a foreign land. He learned that from his father Abraham. Now you get to Isaac's son. Isaac's one of his sons, Jacob. Jacob, his title, what he was called was the deceiver. He had a reputation for deceiving people, and that's just kind of how he lived his life. So what was in one generation transferred to the next, and then got even bigger. And look at King David. King David secretly committed adultery with one man's wife, Bathsheba. So that's bad. He's committing adultery, not a good thing. His son Absalom slept with David's concubines, all of them, up on the roof so the whole public could see. Okay, that's like a lot worse. David's other son, Solomon, had hundreds of wives and concubines, which at some point led his heart astray away from Yahweh. So what was in one generation transferred to the next, and then got even bigger. You see it again and again. So it's not, I just want to recognize this, it's not fair or right that kids grow up with fetal alcohol syndrome because their mom drank too much while they're pregnant. It's not fair or right that babies get born hooked on crack, but it happens every day. It's happening right now, I guarantee you. It's not fair or right that kids are raised in the foster care system because their parents are in prison. But the reality is that the sins of parents affect their children. And that's just the reality of the life that we live. To recognize that when these wicked people in the Old Testament, the choices they were making and the turning their back on God was affecting their children, their poor, innocent children. Our sin affects people around us. We can't get away from that. And also, other people's sins affect us. A lot of times we think, oh, I've sinned before, even King David said, I've sinned before you alone, God, you alone have I sinned against. And that is true in a sense, like we have to go before God. God is going to be ultimate judge. But the consequences of our sin are affecting everyone around us. And if you've ever dealt with any sort of sin in a family situation, is usually where you see that. When my friend in high school I still remember, she said, sin is like puke. You can't help but getting around on the people around you at the same time. And so we have to recognize that when we're talking about the wickedness of the people, that it's not just them, but the entire family. So it really kind of become wicked. Now, this leads to the second. So why the first part, why did God destroy them? Because they're utterly wicked. Secondly, because they would have led the Israelites astray from Yahweh into false gods. They would have led them astray. And you really see this in, a lot of places, but the place I found it was Psalm 106. And in Psalm 106, the psalmist is talking about what happened to the Israelites. And here's the interesting thing. God gave the command to utterly destroy all the peoples. Here's the thing, and this shouldn't surprise you if you know anything about the Israelites. They didn't actually do it. They didn't do it very well. And so the very thing that God was trying to protect them from is what happened. And we see that they did get led astray in Psalm 106. Let me read just that verses 34 through 39 for you, which is on the next page, right here. So it's a psalm. The psalmist says, the Israelites did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but instead they mingled with the nations, and they learned their practices, and they served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons, and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with the blood. Thus they became unclean in their practices, and played the harlot in their deeds. So what the people was doing was wicked, and it was terrible. But the thing that was even worse is that the Israelites picked up on those habits. They were sacrificing their live children to a false god to sort of appease him. And archaeologists have found in these Canaanite lands houses. They would take a child and put it in like a canister, and it would be the foundation of their house, so that it would be like blessing their house. These are wicked practices. And the Israelites, I mean, that's terrible. But then the people of God, God's chosen people, said, I've set you apart, and I want you to be different from everyone else. They started doing it too. And you see why God would say, don't have anything to do with them. So it's a horrendous thing. And we also know, just like when you intermarry, again, you're talking about, certainly the older people, they made those decisions. Let's keep the young, and they can intermarry, and that's okay. Well, again, we see that is not a pretty thing, and I think you know that. But let me just Deuteronomy 7:3-4 says, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. Why? Verse 4. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. The Israelites will be led astray, and we see that they were, but certainly intermarrying is going to be an issue. Taking on their habits and their practices is going to be an issue. Now, another sort of note I want to make about this regarding the concept of being led astray. And I think also gets to sort of the compassion of God versus the holiness of God. He was trying to keep his people set apart and holy because he knew his Messiah was going to come through these people. And this was an important thing. They needed to be marked as different and unique than the rest of the peoples around the world. But when we see the compassion of God is the next thing I want to show you, which is this. Only the near neighbors were to be completely destroyed. God didn't say destroy everyone in your sight. He didn't say have this like vindictive attitude. But what we see is that the faraway people were actually offered terms of peace. And then even if they didn't accept those terms of peace, only the men were killed. So God did say to utterly destroy the people around them. I'm not skirting that issue, but I just also want to recognize that he didn't say that about everybody. He said it about the ones who would be in the land, who would be in their midst. So let me, if I can read for you Deuteronomy 20, you'll see a picture of that, starting at verse 10. It says, when you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If the city, agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. None of them will die. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself. And you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. So only the men are killed. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. So God is making very clear, this is not their like terms of war for everything, but he's just trying to set apart this area and this region. And verse 17, you shall utterly destroy them. Here's the peoples, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you. And verse 18 tells us the why. Again, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. Now, I've only given you one example, but I just want you to see that when we're talking about sort of like, oh, false idol worship, or that's bad, or that's just a religious thing, but it literally, like, they were literally killing each other. Their practices, I guess, let me say it this way, what we believe affects our behavior, affects what we do. And you can't just say, well, that's just a religious thing, and it's just they just followed the wrong God. But it affects everything about their life. And so really, God was trying to protect them from that. So there might be a whole host of reasons, but try to keep things simple. Really, we're talking about why God did it. They're utterly wicked, and he didn't want the Israelites to be led astray. Now, the next question I want to ask is, what can we learn from how God dealt with these people? What does that do for us? What's our takeaways? One thing is this. I think we can see that God is patient. God is very patient. Even when we think things are terrible, and we're like, God, how can you last any longer? Like, why don't you just come now? And we say, well, wow, I just wish Jesus would come back. Well, God is more patient than us. And he is willing to wait a long time for just the right time. He's willing to wait a long time for just the right time. And we always think now's the right time. Like, we're ready. Let's go. Come on. And he said, no, I am patient. And why is he patient? Because of his other attribute. God is compassionate. He's willing to wait as long as possible to give people an opportunity to repent and to return to him. The verse, I think, that shows that the absolute best is 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow about his promises, as some count slowness. I mean, some will say, okay, Jesus, you said you're coming back. Even his disciples thought they were going to come back in their lifetime. They thought, just a few more years, or maybe he'll come back any minute. They're ready, and now we're 2,000 years past. And we're like, what's going on? The Lord is not slow about his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wanting any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. The Lord is just going to wait as long as he can, so as many people as possible can receive the forgiveness that comes through Jesus Christ. God is patient and God is compassionate, but there's another side. Again, we have to have this tension. On the other side of God's patience and compassion are offset by the fact that God takes holiness seriously. His holiness is not something to be trifled with, which is why he needed his people to be set apart. He was setting apart the nation of Israel as unique and distinct from any other people. And the reality of this, then, is that God's tolerance for wickedness can only go so far. He will not tolerate sin forever. We might feel like, man, Lord, why are you putting up with all this? Well, let me say it this way. When we look at other people, we say, man, Lord, why are you tolerating this for so long? But when we look at ourselves, we say, Lord, thank you for being patient and compassionate. But he will not tolerate sin forever. He can only take so much wickedness before he will have to act. The combination of God's holiness and compassion is what caused the complete destruction of the wicked people of the Old Testament. Now, God showed his compassion to the people of the land that he was selling to destroy by giving them 400 years to change. 400 years, God was showing his compassion. He showed his compassion to the Israelites by finally getting rid of the wicked influences in their life. And we see from the Old Testament that when they didn't do that they were influenced wickedly. But he was being compassionate to them by saying, I don't want you to struggle with these guys over and over again. I just clear them out and be holy and set apart for me. My question for us this morning is, do we recognize that the same holiness that is required, the same holiness that we see in God dealing with these people is required for all of mankind's wickedness? That it's not just those wicked Old Testament people, that without Christ we are considered wicked, that we are considered unholy, and it needs God, because of God's holiness, we need some way to interact with a holy God. A holy God cannot have a relationship with an unholy people without first somehow making us holy, without somehow making us set apart. And that is exactly what Jesus did in the great exchange. Jesus took our sin, he took our wickedness, he took our unholiness, and he took his perfection and he gave it to us. He took all of that junk on himself and he gave us his righteousness and his perfectness. so that we could relate to God. We have to recognize first that the holiness of God that we see, even in dealing with Old Testament peoples, is that same holiness that sent Jesus down to earth. And also, then, do we recognize that the compassion of God, the same compassion that caused the Israelites them to wait so long before being destroyed, the compassion of God that said, I can't have you be around these people anymore, like just destroy them so we can have you set apart. God's compassion is the same compassion that he was willing to sacrifice even his own son, send him down to earth to be killed on the cross in order to atone for our wickedness. The holiness of God and the compassion of God. God is patient and he's compassionate, but he is also holy. He was in the Old Testament, he still is today. It hasn't changed. And unless we fall under the holiness that is compassionately offered through the perfect Jesus Christ, it is just a matter of time before God's patience will run out on us too. We need to fall under the holiness of Jesus Christ so that we can relate to a holy God. Let's accept his compassion this morning.